Okay, I'm going to let everyone in and I'm going to start my recording. So I should be able to come in. Welcome everyone. Just making sure everyone's coming in from the waiting room. Hello everyone. Welcome. Welcome everyone. And thank you for joining this Women's Climate Conversation event, Women Speaking Out on COP28. We are recording, so if that means that you'd prefer to have your video off, then please do that, but we'd love to be able to see you. And please keep your microphones on mute, apart from our guest speakers when they're speaking, of course, in due course. Now, in our publicity for this event, we've allowed 90 minutes, as we have 4 guests and a lot to talk about. We might wind up a bit earlier if it seems okay to do so, but we'll see how we go. And thank you all very much for committing your time to this event. I'm presenting this event from Ngunnawal and the Ngambri country here in Canberra, the capital of Australia, where I live within a stone's throw of the Australian Parliament. So it seems like an appropriate place to be hosting this event about the global reality of climate change and speaking with an amazing group of women who were at the last UN Convention on the Parties, or COP, conference, which was held in Dubai in the UAE. I'd like to pay my deep respects to the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri elders of this land where I live, and I thank them for their long custodianship of the land over millennia, and for opening our minds to our relationship with our Mother Earth and our responsibility to care for her as she cares for us. A huge welcome to any First Nations traditional owners who are on this call today. And to all of those of you who are joining from other parts of the globe. It's always very exciting for me to see the registrations coming in for these events and seeing them coming in from different parts of the world. You please introduce yourselves in the chat and say something about your land or your own form of acknowledgement. And a welcome to any men who have joined this event. Your support is critical for our work here. And finally, to complete these general welcomes, I'd just like to say hello to Beck Horridge, who is the producer of Community Radio 3CR program Earth Matters here in Australia, and she's going to make a podcast of this event. Previous podcasts for Radio 3CR have received thousands of known downloads, plus unspecified numbers via Spotify. And I do understand that our women's climate conversations are very popular. You'll meet Beck in person a little bit later. And just to mention that for the 3rd year, this event is part of the National Sustainable Living Festival. I would now like to invite you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine that instead of being on a Zoom call with only these little digital images of our faces to share, I might put us back on gallery view for a minute. We are sitting together in a circle, outdoors somewhere in nature, a big circle that extends right around the globe, with the love of Mother Earth and all her abundance at the center, and our minds open to the possibilities that this conversation and all the work of women around the world in all our diversity can bring to creating security for generations to come and for all life. To bring us into this presence together, I'm going to read some words from the introduction of a favorite book of mine, which is called All We Can Save: Truth, Courage and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. And it's a book of essays and poems and art about different women bringing their perspectives on action on climate change and what we can do together. All around the world, women and girls are making enormous contributions to climate action. Look around you and you will see on the rise climate leadership that is more characteristically feminine and faithfully feminist, rooted in compassion, connection, creativity, and collaboration. We see women and girls engaging in deeply relational, collaborative, and supportive ways, taking the necessary time, making the necessary space, investing in the weft and weave between us. It is clear that we are in this together and that our fates are intertwined. And in many ways, success requires building the largest, strongest team possible. So when you feel ready, if you had your eyes closed during that, please feel free to open your eyes and join the circle. Sorry, I've got to go back on to speaker view, that's it. So yeah, I think that's what we're here for, to be working on this team together that is formed around the world, and we'll be hearing more about that as we go along. In the spirit of our circle, please put your comments and questions into the chat, and we will include them into the conversation as we can. So turning now to our topic for our conversation here today, we know that humanity is at a crossroads for creating a safe future for our descendants and all life on Earth. At a climate update event at the Australian National University a couple of weeks ago, we were warned that we are now counting in only a handful of years to get our carbon emissions under control to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, or even below 2 degrees. The consequences of not achieving this are unimaginable. At COP28 in Dubai, women played a significant role in bringing greater ambition to the fore. From the many non-government participants who worked tirelessly throughout the year and then in Dubai to highlight women's perspectives and solutions, to the women members of government, delegations, UN advisors, and members of the COP presidency team. And even with all this input, the overall decision-making agenda and priorities are still gendered and based on patriarchal systems. At the end of the day, of 133 heads of government who took part in the final negotiations in Dubai, only 13 were women. However, it's heartening to see the international women's movement around climate change gathering momentum and increased advocacy for the interconnections of climate change, human rights, food and water security, biodiversity, and demilitarisation. This movement walks alongside and supports First Nations people and youth, seeing the intersection of First Nations, women's and young people's ways of knowing and experiences to be critical to balance the current power structures and policy paradigms that have got us stuck where we are. COP28 culminated in an international agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. This is known as the UAE Consensus. This was heralded as historic on the one hand and much too weak on the other. Among other declarations, COP28 resolved to drive gender-responsive, just transitions, which strengthen all women and girls' leadership and meaningful participation. 75 countries, or it might even be more now, have signed up to this declaration. Australia is among them. But like so many other international resolutions about gender equity, the words are the easy part, and how it plays out in practice is the critical thing. So I'm going to now introduce our amazing speakers in this conversation, conversationalists we like to call them. And there is a link, I'm just about to there is a link to their bios, which you might have already seen in the information. I'm just putting it in the chat. hope. And I'm just going to give some brief introductions here. Well, quite brief anyway. So first, I'd like to introduce Mamta Borgoyari, who is joining us from New Delhi in India. I'm just looking for Mamta, who I've just lost her. Oh, there she is. I'm going to make her, add the spotlight here. Her bio says that she's the co-director of She Changes Climate. But congratulations are in order today, because just today she's taken up a new role of executive director of that organisation. So congratulations, Mamta. Very well deserved and very exciting development. Formed in early 2020, much the same as the Women's Climate Congress, She Changes Climate is a global movement advocating for inclusion and diversity at all levels of decision making to address the climate crisis and shape a sustainable future for all. They are committed to ensuring women in all our diversity are included as active participants in climate leadership and policy-making processes. Mamta has over 27 years experience in diverse fields of social and environmental justice and has facilitated more than 5,000 women from vulnerable backgrounds to actively run their own small-scale businesses. And more than 300 women farmers have received professional training to practice agriculture proficiently. She was recently honoured by Women Entrepreneur magazine as one of the top 10 women leaders of 2023 in India. How honoured we are to have you with us today, Mamta. So my next guest I'm going to introduce is Angelica Mantikas. I'm just going to find Angelica so that I can put the spotlight on her. Here we go. Add spotlight. So Angelica is joining us from Naarm or Melbourne and is a first generation Greek Australian passionate advocate for the natural world and the stable climate needed for Earth life to thrive. Angelica is a board member and project lead for Australian Youth for International Climate Engagement Incorporated. In this role, she founded the inaugural Oceania Climate Stories Project, a publication compiling the perspectives, stories, experiences and voices of youth from across the continent to bridge the gap between local realities and high-level decision-making spaces, along with other AYFICE colleagues. Angelica attended COP28 and presented the Climate Stories publication at the Australian Pavilion. She also coordinated other youth stakeholder roundtables, which brought together youth from across Oceania to plan a way forward in pushing for stronger climate action. So next I'm going to introduce Tishiko King, who I'll just pop the spotlight on you. There we go. Tishiko King is also joining us from Naarm in Melbourne. Well, I think she is anyway, and is a proud Kalag woman from the island of Masig and Badugal of Themu clan in the Torres Strait. Tish is passionate about sharing culture and amplifying social inequity and the rights of First Nations people. She's studied in ocean science and has experiences in the mineral and exploration industry. And she continues to be part of grassroots organisations supporting the Our Islands, Our Home campaign, which has been led by Torres Strait Island people and advocates for Torres Strait Island climate justice. And finally, I'm going to introduce Sarah. If I can find her here. Here we go. Sarah, here you go. Put the spotlight on Sarah. And Sarah Ransom, our final guest, is based here in Canberra. She is a former Australian diplomat and has previously worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, AusAid and the Asian Development Bank, and as well as within the UN system. She's currently the General Manager of the Australian Water Partnership, which is part of the eWater Group. Her background is in managing programs on governance, gender and community and civil society engagement, and she's advised government on peacebuilding, human rights and development policy. I first met Sarah a few years ago at a training course for the international collaboration, The Art of Hosting Conversations That Matter, and I gather she is an accredited partnership broker. So those are our amazing guests for this conversation. And in the first round of asking them to talk, I'm just going to ask each of our guests to say why they were at COP28 in Dubai and what they achieved there. So I'm going to start with Mamta, who attended COP28 as part of the She Changes Climate delegation. And I think this was the third time that She Changes Climate has had a delegation at COP, and maybe the most significant to date. So Mamta, can you tell us about what you achieved there?
Thank you so much, Janet. First of all, from my heart, deep gratitude. I come deep gratitude, and also would like to kind of remind myself of the roots from where I come in, and you know, I want to thank you for setting in a environment where the feeling of being centered and rooted is important, and thank you so much for setting that environment for us. COP28 was indeed an important event and a milestone for She Changes Climate. And as you mentioned, we started when there was actually no female participation in the COP presidency. And that is when the movement started saying that it is important to have women leaders into the negotiation table and making decisions. And the past 3 years have been a major learning process for us. And I think COP28 was a culmination of the 3 years of learning that we had, where we actually worked with partners across the world to drive the movement of women leadership at the fore. We were there at COP for 2 important reasons. Number one, we were there in full support of the women leaders, the high-level women champions who have been working tirelessly for 1 year in the COP presidency. We have been working very closely with them, and it was very important for us to demonstrate together the strength of standing with women leaders who are already into the process. Number two, we were there to represent the voices of more than 30 women leaders and about 300 partners and 1,000 participants across 5 continents who participated in our Unite for Climate Solutions Summit on 21st November and came up with recommendations which are straight from those women leaders who are fighting the battle at the forefront and have also demonstrated resilience and determination. They are the solution providers. The summit, in those summit, we got recommendations from these women leaders across the globe, and we very strongly wanted to bring the voices and amplify the voices of these women leaders into the COP process. And there was another very important strategy or a value system that She Changes Climate believes in, and which is to lead with compassion, to lead with your heart, and to stand. And as you said, that it's almost like a circle of trust where we really want to leave behind our institutions, our individual self, and come as a group, and therefore talk out and create that safe space while the negotiation process goes on for women leaders who are actually negotiating at the table. So these were the 3 basic reasons why we were there at COP28.
Thanks, Mamta. I'm now going to ask Tishiko. Tishiko, you're a proud Torres Strait Islander, and we know how the perils that your islands are facing from sea level rise. We know about these perils. And I think this was your second COP maybe, or maybe even more. And you were a member of the Australian delegation with access to the Blue Zone. Can you, and I should have mentioned in your introduction that you actually are also an Australian ambassador with She Changes Climate. Can you tell us what this all meant to you and what you were able to achieve there?
Thank you, Janet. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. So before I begin, I too would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kulin kinship, which I live, work, and meet, and pay respects to elders past and present. And I extend those respects to land, sea, and sky country. I want to acknowledge the many footprints of those who have gone before us and honor their contributions to culture, community, and protecting our oceans. And I think it was your beautiful words that centered us in, Janet. As a proud Torres Strait Islander, for those that don't know, but my communities are actually on the front lines of the climate crisis, and urgent action is needed to ensure that they can remain on their islands. King tides, erosion, and inundation, and coral bleaching are threatening the homes and the cultures of Torres Strait Islander people, whilst the Australian government refuses to address the climate crisis. So I was there to call on the Australian government to urgently commit to significantly increase funding adaptation programs like seawalls, so that Torres Strait Islander communities can remain there and continue to practice culture. Um, Last year's COP 28, yes, wow, was my third one, and it building on the work that from the Our Island, Our Home campaign. We were there to continue to really put our government on a spotlight, as we are a fossil fuel heavy, nation. And so it's my responsibility as a Torres Strait Islander to protect and defend my island home and use my education and work together with incredible other women to speak truth about our home. And feel really grateful that I was able to be there as well, and with the She Changes ambassador program, who supported me in being able to achieve having many conversations and connecting up with like-minded folks to be able to stand strong and hold the line for our communities.
Thanks, Tish. That was great to hear. I'm going to now I'm going to go to Angelica now. Angelica, oh, that's okay. Sorry, just getting my I'm getting my bits of stuff here mixed up. So I think this was your second COP, Angelica. And as a youth advocate, you were also part of the Australian delegation. And you were in a group of young people, as we mentioned, presenting a project called Oceania Stories. So will you tell us a little bit about that and what that meant?
Yeah, of course. So kind of before I begin as well, I just want to acknowledge that I am tuning in from Nam, which is Wurundjeri land, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on the land that I'm sitting on right now. And I really also want to dedicate my thanks to the Indigenous peoples who remain to be fervent advocates for a crisis that they did not cause in the first place. So I thank them to start with. In terms of my role at COP and what I did and why I was there, so yeah, that Janet, you're right. This was my second COP. I feel like the first COP for everyone, you're kind of finding your feet and figuring out where you belong, what's going on amongst the craziness. But COP28 was so ginormous that I kind of felt like it was my first COP all over again, and I was finding my feet all over again. But I was there leading a delegation of 8 fantastic and diverse young Australians. And essentially our goal was, it was part of this Oceania Climate Stories project that you've heard mentioned a couple times now. And the goal of the project was to gather stories. It was the first time we've ever run the project, so it was a complete, throw in the wind and see what happens. And we wanted to gather stories essentially together and bring those stories from people who couldn't attend COP, people who didn't know how to engage with the technical policy dialogue, who didn't understand what an NDC is or what the UNFCCC is, but they knew that their community was being impacted, or they had climate anxiety, or they experienced the bushfires and they had a journal entry from when they were 9 years old. And so we got all of these different stories together and made a little publication. I actually have one of the physical versions here with me. And so the goal of this was to essentially bring various stories from across the region to this, I hate saying high level, but high level decision-making space, and to really bridge that gap between the realities of people who don't know how to engage in the space and with a space that, you know, is really determining their futures. And so as part of the Oceania Climate Stories program, we also ran a COP28 Youth Climate Delegate program, which was, so as people were submitting their stories, they had the option to also elect or apply to attend COP. And we had some fantastic, fantastic delegates as part of that program. And I cannot tell you, Tisha's nodding her head because they were just so wonderful. And we essentially wanted to get them to COP so they could share their stories in person and they could actually engage with these spaces and do whatever they wanted with that space. Whether they wanted to engage really heavily with the negotiations and they were super interested in the technical policy aspect, or perhaps they wanted to engage more with the expo-like part of the other side of COP, where there's all the pavilions. And so as part of that, we ran an event called the Oceania. It was actually called Future Visions. And it was essentially a conversation about how young people are experiencing climate change at the moment in Oceania and what solutions we have as well. Because as young people and, you know, as people on the front lines, they're not just victims, but they have the solutions to them too. And so we wanted to really highlight that and to highlight the importance of these dialogues. And it was a very vulnerable event that we held. And there were a lot of tears, which was great. I myself was shedding quite a few. But that's the beauty of storytelling. And I think that's what's missing so often in these spaces is being vulnerable, kind of taking down that armor and showing your heart and showing your soul. And that's what we did with that event. And I'm incredibly proud of that. And we also ran some other events and participated in other events. We had a Pacific Australian Youth Breakfast in the Australia Pavilion. And we had like a youth get together in the Monash Pavilion trying to kind of workshop the climate movement and get us all on the same page. But our real goal was to elevate the presence of youth and particularly, you know, within the Oceania region, and really bridge that gap between people who don't know and don't have the access to engage and the need for their voices to be heard.
Thanks very much, Angelica. And participants might notice I am putting some links into the chat, which link to some of the things that our wonderful conversationalists are mentioning, including to some of these events. I personally haven't been to COP, but I became this year quite a COP voyeur, I suppose, from afar, because many of these events are recorded, and once you've clicked in on some of these links I've put there, you probably can start looking around. You can find other events that were at the Australian Pavilion and in other pavilions, and it's very interesting to do. So finally, I'm going to turn to Sarah, who, as the General Manager of the Australian Water Partnership, you were there with some of your other water group partners. So can you tell us a little bit about your role at COP? And I'm going to put a link to your session into the chat now.
Thank you, Janet. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge that I'm joining this conversation from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to thank the Ngunnawal people for the care that they've shown to country and to community and to waters over the years. I'd also like to acknowledge the Women's Climate Congress and the work that you do, Janet's fearless leadership and the many, many volunteers that are involved in this incredible grassroots organisation. I'm a WCC member myself, and I've joined a couple of the previous conversations, so it's really extra exciting to be asked to speak tonight, so thank you. I'm here as a woman who was privileged enough to attend COP28 in a leadership role. and working in a male-dominated sector as well. So obviously working in water. And the organisation, the Australian Water Partnership, is actually funded by the Australian government through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And our role is to build partnerships around climate resilient, sustainable water resource management across the Indo-Pacific. So in practice, that means that we work with around 250 Australian partner organisations, and we broker partnerships with governments, researchers, and civil society organisations across Asia and the Pacific. We've been running for about 9 years, and we've had a specific focus on climate for about 3 years now. So it was also our third COP. So it was my first, but AWP's been part of 3 COPs. Our first one was Glasgow in COP26, where we became core partners of the Water Pavilion when it was first established. And so pavilions are like event and convening spaces across COP. So they're inside the blue zone, which means that access is controlled. You have to have a pass from an organisation that's accredited, or through a country, through your country getting an overflow pass, which is how I got mine. So you need to be able to get into the space somehow. But I guess our experience over the 3 years has been that Glasgow was about 20,000 participants inside the blue zone, as from what the numbers I could find, and that was overwhelming enough. COP27 in Egypt was about 12,000, so it's a bit of a dip. I'm not sure if those figures are super reliable, but then at COP28 there was 100,000 on some days inside the blue zone. So I think it's fair to say that the agenda has grown and it's expanding. So it's a super interesting space because COP sort of changes all the time. As far as our objectives, so we had 2 objectives, and one was, like Angelica said, around stories. So we supported participation of Pacifica women and Indigenous voices, particularly on water and climate issues. And we're also there to contribute to an ongoing and quite emergent piece of work to try to map and quantify and communicate the interdependencies of water and climate. There was a lot of kind of business on this year. It was a really important year for COP. There were 3 sort of major negotiating items, all of which were really, really important for us in the water space. So obviously the first one was the Loss and Damage Fund. There was an early announcement about that, which was really positive, and I think set quite a good tone for that really critical piece of finance. And then the global stocktake took place, and the global goal on adaptation was the other one. All 3 really relevant to our work on water and climate. We also ran a number of sessions across various pavilions, and we also supported the attendance of 3 senior water sector people from Australia who were there to kind of get into non-water spaces and talk about water across COP in areas of their various specialities. So our first was Carleen Maywald, who's a former South Australian water minister and the current South Australian water ambassador, and a very, very fierce advocate for women's leadership in water and climate. Our second expert was Dr. Phil Duncan, who's a senior Kamilaroi man from northern New South Wales, who's worked a lot of his career in the Murray-Darling Basin, and Professor Tony Wong from Monash University, who's a world expert on water-sensitive urban design. I'll just say, like, I felt like our engagement in COP was quite successful. We sort of stuck to the plan and didn't get too distracted by all of the stuff that's going on. This is a very, very overwhelming event to attend. Yeah, I felt like our work sort of with storytelling and with the voices, particularly of women and Indigenous people around water and climate issues, was a good contribution to make, and some of the policy work that we contributed to on the global goal on adaptation was important too. But I have to say I'm still processing. It was a really big experience for me, very overwhelming. And yeah, just one final thought, I guess, is that for us, COP runs all year. So this is work that we do all the time, and that so participating in a conversation tonight is really important for us to kind of make the connections and grow the group of people who are thinking and working in this space, and help us to support each other in our work. So thanks, Janet.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you all of you for sharing, and thank you all of you for going to COP, for doing all of this really, really important work on behalf of us all of the global citizens that are dependent on these very important decisions that are made there. I'm just going to ask Beck, I mentioned earlier, who's the producer of Earth Matters on Radio 3CR. She has actually got a question. I thought we'd slip her question in here and we'll let our guest conversationalists answer that. So hi, Beck.
Hi. Well, this is like a kickoff question. I'm not quite sure. Some of you were invited into high-level negotiation rooms. Some of you weren't. Obviously, when you were at COP, you must have had a range of experiences. But what methods did you experienced worked to be heard? So what did you actually have to do to have your concerns taken into proper account at the decision-making level? Like, what sort of practical action did you find yourself doing before you felt your message was received? So, like, what did you learn about how to be effective at COP? If you felt you were. But if question isn't relevant and another story comes to mind, let's hear that.
Thanks, Beck. That's great. I might go to Tish first on this. Is that okay, Tish? Can we?
I think just from that question, the top line thing for me was, as it being my third one, over the years I've been able to, one thing at COP is that it's an opportunity to connect and be with, other communities that are fighting to protect and defend their country. And so collaboration is a really big one. We just had Sarah just share about the how many people attended at last year's COP. But because of the size of the space that it was held, I felt really far removed. And so it was, connecting with other community members and leaders that I had built relationships over at these spaces and other international spaces to see how we can go in together and stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity to have our messages heard. Be able to, strengthen that, it's a lot of like WhatsApp signals, like all of the different platforms, telegrams, trying to get everyone everywhere at what time, so that, and with so much going on in side events within the Blue Zone, trying to get, last minute meetings, before negotiations, start moving up. And so it was a lot of that for me. And then it was just a lot of getting lost. So it was just like trying to weave through everyone and trying to find and going in circles. But I might pass it over to someone else.
Maybe Angelica, you could pick this up.
Yeah, sure. I definitely agree with Tish. There were a lot of WhatsApp messages being forwarded through different chats, lots of signals, because the truth is, especially as civil society, advocates being there, we don't have the reality is we just don't have the same power as, a negotiator or a head of delegation. So we need to band together and we need to all, send a message and say, okay, come outside meeting room 4, there's an action at 11 p.m. And we just need to get the numbers, because for us, it's the numbers and it's the loudness that often that's how we get our voices heard. And so, it's frustrating at some points, but at the same time, it's also incredibly heartwarming to see how many people come out, to support the same thing. I remember the night, I think it was a late night when I think it was the draft decision text on like the global stock take came out, and everyone, it was not a good text. It was not a good outcome. No, we weren't happy with it at all. And I was sad, lots of people were sad, but everyone was like, you know what, we're just gonna have a big action. And everyone formed like a little line outside the corridors as all the negotiators were going in. And so you had all of civil society who, didn't have necessarily the passes to get into the rooms, but they were reminding the negotiators, this is who you're representing. These are our futures at stake. And so by standing there with hands up, all holding hands like this, we're really reminding them of the impact and of how influential they really can be in these spaces and who they're representing to. So you can penetrate the corridors of power, quite literally. You just get in there. But yeah, whether your voice is heard is a whole other thing. But yeah, I think another thing I found quite useful, I was lucky this year to attend on a party badge, which is like a little pink badge that says party, and you go with, and it says like the country you're with. And I went with the Australian government, which I found was a very different experience to attending last year, I should say, COP27, where I was on a observer badge, which meant I could actually enter some of those rooms. I couldn't negotiate because I was on a party overflow. But I could enter and I could, hear the negotiations, as they were going on. I could ask the Australian negotiators, like, hey, what does that mean? What's actually going on here? When I had questions, and send updates to my friends who weren't in the room too. So I think having that access, having that party badge did also help too. And yeah, having just like meetings with negotiators before and after, and signaling this is what young people want. What's going on? How can we make these things work? Even pre-COP preparing, just understanding what's on the agenda, because when you're in COP, it's just, there's so much going on. You don't have the time, a lot of the time, to really sit there and teach yourself everything that's going on. But yeah, a lot of it is even just like chasing decision makers down in the halls or in the corridors. You get a meeting with, a leader for 20 seconds and you're just like, oh, make sure you don't vote for this. We want a fossil fuel phase. Yeah, that's my input.
Thanks very much, Angela. We might pick up on some of those a little bit more on the points that you've raised there in a minute. And can I just, Tish, did you have one of these little pink badges that you could go into the...
Yes, I did. And I think just adding like access, like it's just really interesting how that changes depending on what delegation you're with and what your badge color looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I was with a party overflow, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we might come back to that. But I thought I might bring you in, Mamta, here, because with She Changes Climate, you have talked a lot about radical collaboration, and you have done a lot of work pre-COP, working with the presidency team. So anyway, I'd just like to invite you to say something about that and your experience of these these dialogues that you were trying to set up with at very high levels. Yeah.
So I think I want to reiterate what Tish and Angelica said. I think we witnessed the power of collectives there. It is strong. It is the inherent strength of collectives and collaboration cannot be undermined. And I think we really need to, that's a big learning, and we really need to stick to it and to empower it and to give more strength to this collective. Just as an example, the Majlis that was called was because of the pressure of the collaboration, what Angelica talked about, coming together, raising your hands silently, that was the power, and that is what radical collaboration is all about. And I think that, and that is the strength which we really need to catch on to and to strengthen it. Number two, I think that I would also reiterate the pink badge, the importance of it, and also our experience of being there for the ambassadors, for the She Changes Climate ambassadors. And we witnessed, because I think we should not forget that the bilaterals or the country level dialogues are very crucial to the outcome as well. And if you're able to influence at the national level, if you can reach there, your voice to reach the negotiation, the probability is much higher. And I have to say, I was so impressed and encouraged and motivated by our ambassadors. And I saw how, so we did this process of, what Angelica said, that there has to be some, training is not the right word, orientation, access to how negotiation happens. So we did a process much before the COP event, where we actually had some of our ambassadors be there in the UNFCCC meetings to see how negotiations, so kind of preparation for what the process is. And then there, I witnessed how, so some of our ambassadors had the pink budget, some did not. But what I realized was the strength and the ease and the comfort with which they went into the national pavilions, and the conversation they started with the delegation there. It is very important and crucial for the next year also, because we go back, and that's why we realize in She Changes Climate the importance of country networks. So, just to share with you that we are really strengthening the movement by bringing or rooting it at the country level. So we are starting the She Changes Climate network at country levels, at 5 country levels now. And the idea is actually rooting the movement and getting inputs at the build the momentum from the base, because that is where it all starts from and will end with. So that's something that is very, very important that we realize. The third was the pavilions. I think that, and I've shared earlier that there's so much in the pavilion that is happening, and I wish that some of those who are sitting at the negotiation table spends more time in the pavilion than they are on the table. I think things will change drastically. I witnessed some of those who are engaged in the pavilion, in the negotiation table, and how they come back to the pavilion, take the input, the conversation happens there. And that is very, very important. The women's pavilion, the WGC work was really, really led by these discourses that were happening in the pavilion. And I think that, and again, it's the power of the collective there. We were all standing there, as women leaders, as young champions, with aspiration, passion, and wanting to share what needs to go into the negotiation. So these are very, very, these are the 3 important things that we realize, and it's a big learning for us on how we shape the She Changes Climate movement and advocacy movement as well.
Thanks very much, Mamta. And Sarah, do you want to add something to this question?
Yeah, just that I really agree with what Mamta just said about how difficult it is to figure out how the negotiation side works. And I think it changes. It's my feeling over the last 3 years is it changes every year as well. So you might find an entry point in one year, but then you have to find something new the next year. Yeah, just the other thought I had on that one was in terms of influence. So I actually think for us, at least, arriving at COP and trying to influence an agenda is too late. You need to be working ahead of time. So for us, it's, some of the really critical work that we were involved in was, if there's trade-offs that have to be made, and the negotiations are negotiations. Some things get in and other things get traded off. And for us, it was being able to confidently articulate some of the reasons why water and climate issues needed to be looked at more closely than they had been in the past. It might surprise you to know that water is not mentioned in the UNFCCC at all, and in the subsequent agreements all the way up until, I think it was only COP27 when you started to see water come through the formal decisions. And yeah, I guess going back to that point about stories, like the people who we were working with at COP and working with the head of COP talked about water as being critical. One of our partners that we were at COP with, his name is Turia Wickham. She's a leader in her community in Papua New Guinea, and her role in her community is to work towards safe water and sanitation. And this work is about absolutely fundamental rights for women and girls, and it's becoming harder already every day because of climate change. Just things like clean water, which we take completely for granted in urban Australia, is still really hard to come by, and climate change is making it even harder. You know, women in her community are fighting things like deadly and completely preventable diarrheal diseases, which kills children, and that's becoming harder due to climate change. There's more conflict. Women's burdens are becoming heavier because they need to walk further for water. It just goes on, and it's not fair. Like, these women didn't cause these problems. So to me, the stories are really, really important. And I guess, yeah, my engagement with COP, I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, I perceive a gap between the work that goes on in the policy space and just the urgency and the relevance and the importance of these stories that come out. Yeah, so this sort of disconnecting COP is quite an interesting thing, and I hope that we'll see more progress on this as time goes on and the years go on. We'll see more interactions between the pavilions where these incredible stories are just going on and people just amazing, and then the sort of the slow pace and the formality of the negotiations. So I hope that that's the case. Yeah.
Thanks. And I just was having a quick squiz through the participants we have online here, because Turia Wickham, who you have mentioned, had contacted me in real. She's not, no, but she isn't actually online.
She's not here.
She's based in PNG, everyone. So, you know, probably difficult.
She's a wonderful woman and a water
well,
warrior.
I just wanted us to sit for a moment with the thought that here is this person who Sarah had in her session at COP28, and she registered and she contacted me in relation to this event tonight. She hasn't actually been able to be with us, but we can hold her in our thoughts. If you look at Sarah's, the recording that I put the link in the chat earlier of Sarah's session, you'll see she is very inspiring. Everyone in the session was very inspiring, actually, but talking about that very women's perspective in relation to water. Thanks very much for bringing that, Sarah. So I've got some questions. So we thought we can have a bit more of a sort of a free-flowing conversation, and of course any of our guests can bring in different aspects of their story that they've already told us so far. But I've got some questions popping up here in the chat. And one of them is from Noha Shaker. She says, "Hello, ladies. It's great pleasure to be here. I was a non-party member for the Global Stocktake since its conception in November 2021 during COP26. It's a very important tool to share input, discuss challenges and propose solutions." Just wonder whether you might briefly like to comment on that, Mamta. And maybe some of our listeners aren't even 100% familiar with exactly what the Global Stocktake is, so it could be good to.
So very, let me first say that we are happy that the Global Stocktake, the observations in the Global Stocktake, that for the first time gender equality, empowerment, women, intergenerational equity were mentioned in that. However, the fear is because if we look at past and we look at what has happened to intentions, which is not translated unless and until you are very specifically focusing, not just mentioning these words. So these don't remain words, but has to be translated into actions. I was part of, and I was there in the Women's Pavilion, which WGC was holding it, and been part of all the conversations that were happening, the emotion, the passion, the crying, the unity, wanting to come together, witnessed it all, and been sat through this all. And then when the final the final document or the report update is shared, you just feel sad, and you feel what I'm lack of word, but it's a very, very dampening feeling, because we witnessed the effort, the frustration. Yes, you're right, Noah. Because I've witnessed the amount of energy that is put in, the amount of aspiration, the amount of the pain and resilience and learning of those women who at the front line put into the process. And to just have a mention which we acknowledge, and we are glad it is mentioned. The words are mentioned, but now let's see what happens to it in terms of action. So, as Noah says, that I think that we really need to push and not be happy with the mere mention of women in documents, with the mere mention of empowerment and equity in documents. But we really now need to say, this is non-negotiable. When we say equity, the demands that have been made have to be put in. The inclusion and diversity principles have to be put in words and actions. This crisis is looming large on us. There is no time. And, I don't think that mere mention of words is enough for us to reach where we want to reach.
Can I add onto that? Thank you, Mamta, for sharing. Just because as like a Torres Strait Islander, firstly, the global stocktake was the first time that the global regime, the climate regime, took stock of how the international community has collectively reduced greenhouse gas emissions from since Paris. And so, that the biggest takeaway from the stocktake, has told us what we really already knew. And what you were just sharing, Mamta, really triggered me is that where the world is way behind, and 1.5 degree of warming limit agreed in Paris is at risk. And for communities like mine, it's like how climate justice vastly differs to climate action. How 1.5 could mean a fighting chance for my communities, but 2 degrees could mean the end. And so these systems will the weapons that can make us or sell us out. So it's really important.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Tish. Does anyone else want to make a comment at that point? I'm just looking at, I've got another message. There's another question here. We need Minister Tanya, that's our Australian Environment Minister, and other ministers to foster a delegation group similar to ERA. This is from Donnell Davis. So we Aussie women can shape our language, ethos and paragraphs to add to the zero draft well in advance. That idea of having what Donnell is referring to here is the process that occurs with the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, where women's organisations like ours all the way around the world have access to documents and actually can send comments on the language and the drafting of a final statement that comes out. So I suppose...
No, more than that. Have we got...
Donald, hello.
Hello. Have we got a minister looking after us in the delegation to go to COP?
Thanks, Donnell. We'll put that to the...
Oh, no, I'm serious. And we might need more than one minister because the model's already there. Even if it's token in the beginning, would be wonderful.
Maybe Angelica, or you could answer that in relation to your relationship to the department. Thanks, Donna. If you could put yourself back on mute now, I'll get the guest to take this question up. Angelica, in relation to your relationship with the Australian government delegation and the way they looked after you, is there an answer there to how they, once you'd got your badge, were you part of a group that
So essentially, so this, like I said, this year my COP experience was very different compared to last year. So there's a very big difference between being part of a party delegation and not being part of a party delegation, really. And so this year, it was the first time the Australian government has ever run, it was called a travel grant program. And so we used that as well to fund our youth delegates, and it was a very helpful program. But as part of that, there was also kind of like a youth liaison role, which has never happened before. And so speaking on behalf of youth, the youth liaison role, it wasn't like we didn't have the minister for youth there. But it was one of the negotiators and also who works in the department, Jared, and he was fantastic and quite useful to go to whenever we had any difficulties or we wanted to, meet up with negotiators or things like that. And so in terms of having like a youth person, he was very helpful. He was also negotiating, so he was like negotiating ACE, which is Actions for Climate Empowerment, and that also included gender equality and women as well. And so you could go to him if we had kind of like recommendations on things like that as well. I wasn't following women's and gender equality as much in the text, so I didn't have any specific recommendations to go to him about. But it wasn't more like the only minister that was there. Oh, there were actually two ministers there that I know of. There was obviously Minister Bowen came and the Assistant Minister McAllister, but also Minister Kearney came as well, who's the Minister for Health, and she was fantastic too. But yeah, there was no Minister for Youth there or for women.
Okay, thank you. I can see there is a whole issue there of what Danelle is trying to raise, which I will take up after this conference, because I think there's a good issue to really get our heads around in relation to women and the input that women can have in these negotiations. But of course, climate change is something that affects everyone. So I think, yeah, it's maybe harder for it just to be seen as something that women are having input into. We want women to have equal input, but there are, youth and First Nations and all the men as well. So it's not quite as, yeah. Anyway, I can see an interesting issue which will maybe take up a future women's climate conversation. Yeah, I'm just looking at the questions. I did have another question from Mary Pickard about the organisation of the Women's Pavilion, which you have partly answered, Mamta, about the Women and Gender Constituency, that's WGC. And you mentioned that they do run the pavilion because they are a recognised constituency under the UN FCC, which so is She Changes Climate a member of the Women and Gender Constituency? Is that your observer?
Yes,
so you have
we
observer status that way. Yeah, excellent. So so just coming back to some of the other sort of issues from COP, I thought we might just be able to talk about briefly amongst the our guests here. I just wondered, Tish, whether you might like to say a little bit more about the loss and damage fund and how that relates to your campaign with the Torres Strait and the One Island campaign.
Yes, as mentioned earlier, Sarah had shared that it was, one of the big things that we saw in the first few days was that the loss and damage fund was operationalized. But one of the, but some of the things that, myself and many Indigenous people experienced was that there's actually flaws within this system right now. The commitment of financial resources from the global north to the global south to support this fund is actually a pin drop in the ocean of what's required. There was sort of no process in a way of, I think what we're sort of saying, there's some gaps of like how we sort of like the different layers of the structures of the systems in order to be able to get through like different negotiation processes. And so there were just many voices missing to be part of these conversations. And where they're saying is that, the way that we can access this fund is only through small grants, when we know that there's many people that need millions up to billions of dollars. This fund is to help support, people right across this globe. And so it's like still identifying those urgent and regional priorities. And importantly, how is this, fund going to be accessed? It was really sort of shared that only small island developing nations can access this. So how this sort of relates back to me, back to in our context domestically, Australia is a developed nation. And so it was through the incredible win of the Torres Strait 8 in September 2022, the Australian government was actually found by the United Nations Human Rights Committee to have violated the human rights of Torres Strait Islanders through inaction on climate change. And so this landmark decision obliges the Australian government to pay adequate compensation, which is loss and damage, to the claimants, and do whatever it takes to ensure that they have a safe existence in the Torres Strait Islands. And it set precedent for Indigenous people all around the world. And so as a developed nation and as Torres Strait Islander people that won a case on loss and damage, unfortunately, through these structures, we're unable to access this fund. And so that's why it was so important for me to be able to represent not only my island community, but Torres Strait Islander people, to really urge and make our government accountable for their, lack of inaction and progress to ensure, adaptation programs, especially when we continue to see our environmental minister approve fossil fuel mines. And so these are the gaps. And we go back to global stocktake about how 1.5 matters, how it means to our communities. And so, it really, it's a really reflection of these, systems and these structures in place, and, some of the challenges that, you might get so far, but there's still some gaps. And so, with this, it was, I guess, just a part, some of those outcomes that sort of fell short. We saw, this was the first COP to officially acknowledge that fossil fuels are the root cause of climate change, yet had watered down text and the language. And instead of using, phase out, they would rather use transition away, which is just not strong enough. And so to travel all the way there, to come all the way back and face our communities to tell them these outcomes, it continues to see that loss and damage as we continue to bear right now in the Torres Strait Islands, monsoonal season. We're seeing king tides continue to, rise high and take away our burial sites, our totems. These are our stories, and we're talking about, how much more we need to amplify them. These are the ones that are right here at home.
Thanks. Yeah, that's it's so important. And just taking a moment to think about that. And in a minute, I'm just watching the time. We might just spend a moment thinking about the next steps, thinking about COP39 and beyond, 29, I should say, sorry, and beyond. I just wanted to come back to you, ma'am, to just for a moment to talk about this women raising ambition and a little bit about your work with the UAE team, including the high-level champion and the vice presidents, who are both women, and your interaction with the president, Sultan Dr. Al Jaber. If you could just tell us a little bit of that story about how that, that is related to this introduction of the words transition away from fossil fuels, which is a good thing that those words got in there. We don't think that they're enough, but what role do you feel that that advocacy that you were part of played in that?
Yeah, thank you, Janet, for that question. It's a very, very live question, I think, even now.
Yeah.
So I just want to add on to what Tish said. I think there's something very important that she talked about, and that is about this whole notion of that we see, in negotiations to homogenize identity. And, while I think that this is a problem. And this is a problem because this doesn't work. And therefore, there are all these loopholes that we see. homogenizing women, homogenizing indigenous communities, homogenizing countries. I think we really, really need to recognize the diversity that exists, and it is the diversity that needs to be catered to and looked at for when we are looking at solutions. So that's one very important point which we recognize in She Changes Climate, and also really strongly advocate for, and I've witnessed it spending most probably half of my time in the indigenous community, indigenous pavilion there at COP. I mean, the diversity, the knowledge, the solutions. And, you know, by just homogenizing everything, we're just losing out on solutions that's just right there for us, you know, which caters to the speed that we need to, which caters to the details that we need to do. And the loss and damage fund, the announcement was, well, it was good, but as Tish said, that I think it was just a drop in the ocean. I mean, it was not even a drop in the ocean. I mean, it is nothing. And then when are we going to learn from the past? It isn't that there is no climate fund existing in the global across. I mean, there are a number of climate funds, but look at access and where it goes, and the process delays, the bureaucracy, the intent. There's so much of lessons to be learned from that. We really need the declarations, the policies, everything has to reflect back to the learnings. We cannot create new things and create new processes. There's so much to learn from the past. And I feel that, and therefore, again, I feel that it's very important that country engagement, again, because that's where you can really, really, you know, grip where you have to grip it and kind of then bring in these issues. And they are the ones who can then bring it at the negotiations table. Yeah, so coming back to the session and the interaction that happened. There are a few learnings, and before I come to, I wouldn't go into details about how it happened, why it happened. I think we were very clear. It was it was a online summit that we were doing with the theme Unite for Climate Solutions, and we were bringing in, you know, different leaders, 30 leaders that I mentioned across 5 continents. We had about more than 1,000 participants across time zones actually sitting through. And the idea was twofold. The idea was first to have women leaders from the front talk about, come with recommendations for COP presidency to take forward. And we are, you know, very, very appreciative of the high-level champions in the COP presidency, 27 COP presidency team, Her Excellency Hana Al-Hashmi and Her Excellency Razan Al-Mubarak. They were amazing women. And we have been interacting with them for almost 6 months, leading to the online summit and then to COP. And their hard work need not be determined. Their passion and their commitment to bring in women-centered decision is amazing. And they were part of our online summit, speaking about listening. Actually, they heard the entire summit, and it ran through different time zones. It was almost a day-long online event. And they sat through all these recommendations that emerged out and the discussions that happened. The last session, and we were very grateful to the presidency, where they agreed, where Sultan Al-Jaber agreed to have a conversation with Mary Robinson from the elders on a dialogue specifically focused on phasing out fossil fuels. And if you have not seen the video, I'm sure you can go back and watch it.
I've just put the link in the chat.
Okay. I'm going to speak about few lessons and few things were very clear to us in that conversation. The importance of asking the hard question. I think that you have to ask the difficult questions. You know, it's very important. Do not step back. Do not, you know, you have to ask the difficult question, however difficult, however hard it is. It's also important to have leaders who have the steel, if I may say, and the compassion and a demonstrated experience of asking the question, which cannot be evaded, it's not an evasive question. It's a very strong, single, simple question. It was supposed to be a conversation, and what we also witnessed is how, well, I hope I won't be quoted, but how the difference between the feminine and the masculine energy. It was a display of a feminine and masculine energy that happened there. While Mary was completely strong, silent, calm, asking her questions, we did see the agitation that happened on the other part. So there are these two learnings, but what emerged out and why we need to have these conversations, however difficult it is, however uncomfortable it is what happened. And though we are completely, as Tish said, that we are not happy that there is no phase out, but for the first time, you know, it is mentioned, they're talking about transitioning out of it. We're not happy with it. We're not fully happy with it, but we are happy that the moment started. There was a lot of pressure, and please do not forget that the pressure, and that was like the turning point when the moment it happened, you know, we had 1,700 leaders across stakeholders, corporate, academic, and civil society come together and sign that letter asking for phasing out of fossil fuel. It was collective. It was a moment for collectives, what collectives can do. It was very strong. And I think that had that not happened, we would not have had this even as one of the outcome. So I think that, so this has been amazing in terms of what collectives can do. The other thing for us as She Changes Climate is also, I have to share with you, because, you know, it is not just that event, you know, it is post-management of what happens, the pressures that can come on organization from different aspects, from different corners to what do you highlight, you don't highlight, you know, the pressures are so strong. And I think this is where the integrity and the purpose of a movement or an organization stands tested. And it did happen to us. And, you know, but we maintained that we are there as a voice of the 30 women leaders who have come up with recommendation. And this conversation was part of that. And we are not going to, you know, not going to we're going to stand by what has happened. And let me tell you, somebody spoke about vulnerability, you know, I think Angelica spoke about, one of you spoke about vulnerability, the importance of, you know, not being embarrassed about your vulnerability. And I think we all witnessed it within the team, that how vulnerable you can become. But then if you can really, really face your vulnerability, you get strength out of it. And it was a great moment of learning for a movement like of women leadership. And there are huge learnings from that we have gathered. And the next journey of She Changes Climate is largely driven from the lessons that we have learned from these events that happened last year. 2023 was momentous for us, huge learnings for us.
Thank you, It is a big story. I invite you to check out the links that I've just put in the chat, which are linked to the little conversation between Mary Robinson and Sultan Al Jaber as part of that online national forum, Women's Leadership Forum, and also the press conference that was held at COP, where he was responding to the big press response to that conversation. And I mean, in Women's Climate Congress, we do talk about creating unlikely allies, and that if we can't get into some sort of conversation with the people who seem to be holding the power, in this case the fossil fuel industry, if we can't somehow come into conversation with them, then you know, we can't create this radical collaboration that Mamta was talking about before. So I think this is a really important little case study of some amazing work that was done there. And I just, with that, because time is getting away, I'd like to turn quickly to what are the next steps. And maybe I'll go now to Angelica for a moment, and then Sarah, and I'll just go around and you can talk about what you think, what's next, what's coming, what's what's ahead for COP29 and for the women's movement too, and for youth and for First Nations people. Angelica, do you want to have a stab at that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I feel like there's two things. There's what I think is probably going to happen and what I would love to see happen. And what I think is going to happen is probably something similar. Like the reality is I don't have my hopes up too high for COP29. Azerbaijan is hosting, which is another petro state. And I think I got my hopes up this year with the UAE hosting a bit. I didn't want to be pessimistic. I didn't want to think the worst. I wanted to think, you know what, this is a real opportunity. If you're having, you know, the head of one of the biggest fossil fuel emitting corporations in the world, you know, as the COP president, that's a huge opportunity because he can then lead the shift of that entire industry. And that was how I wanted to hope that things would happen and things would work out. However, as we've discussed, you know, you have the COP president then saying how there's no science behind the 1.5 degree target, and, you know, making secretive fossil fuel deals behind everyone's backs. So I'm not incredibly optimistic that it's going to be super different this year, but I think it's going to be a much smaller COP. From what we experienced in the UAE this year, I'm not sure how much external participation there's going to be in with a lot of the civil society actors that I've been speaking to from across the world. Everyone's questioning whether it's worth going to COP. You know, is it worth traveling? Is it, you know, after this year, I think people are quite disheartened. So I'm not expecting a lot in terms of civil society influence. In terms of general youth engagement, so this year at COP, they established, it was passed that there's going to be the youth climate champion role. So it's the first ever, it's this idea, we've institutionalized essentially a youth climate representative within the COP presidency. So that means there's essentially a youth power representing us at that high COP presidency level. But, you know, once again, we're not entirely sure what that's going to look like and how it's going to play out for this year either. But it is definitely a step in the right direction, and it means all other presidencies will also have a youth climate champion too. But I think it's really interesting to look at potentially in the future. We've got COP30 and then COP31, which, you know, COP30 held in Brazil, hopefully the Indigenous Peoples COP. I think that's going to be enormous and hopefully have a lot more impact on the negotiation side of things. COP31, if we have a Pacific COP here in Australia, I would really like to think Australia by then has announced a phase out of fossil fuels. We've stopped approving new fossil fuel projects. But that once again it's gonna happen because there's pressure on our government to make that happen. And how we apply that pressure, who applies that pressure, do we, you know, how it works. I think there are a lot of questions there too. But I think just in general, the COP process itself is not conducive to the urgent change that we need. It doesn't, we have 5 years, really 5-6 years to get this crisis under wraps. You know, only this year the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalized. After how many decades have LDCs have people been calling for a loss and damage fund, and it was only operationalized. We don't even have that funding yet. So I think the really slow pace of the UN doesn't reflect the urgency that we need. We need true systems change. We need to change the way we value things in our society, instead of continuing to value success based on the degradation of habitats, off of, you know, displacing Indigenous peoples from their lands. Like, we measure that as success in terms of economic growth at the moment. So until we really change those structural things, my thoughts on the COP process itself and on the effectiveness of these places, unfortunately, isn't too optimistic. But I refuse to give up. Young people refuse to give up, because at the end of the day, we don't have a choice. Like, this is our futures, these are our lives, and we're going to fight till the end.
Thanks, Angelica. Fighting words. Tish, your take on what the next steps are?
Yeah, I think, you know, building on, what Angelica was saying is just that, you know, these spaces, like, you know, sometimes it's really disheartening when you come to the end and the text is just, you know, not ambitious enough. And so with last year's text falling short and watered down commitments, you know, to a wish list is really an insult to those that come here to fight for our survival. While this year is in another fossil fuel petrol state, there are just some communities that don't have a choice but to show up and continue to advocate and fight. And so, you know, with this looking like it being exactly in Azerbaijan, you know, they announced like the organizing committee for COP29 summit, you know, has like a 28-member committee with 0 women. That 28 committee has all men members. Let that sink in. And so we know that women make up half of the world's population, but are disproportionately affected. You know, we know that their studies show that when you have diverse, and we're talking about it, when there are more diverse voices in the room, better decisions and better outcomes come that are, you know, nurture centered and centered with that radical love, radical collaboration. And so if we are to put out the fire, we really need to stop fueling it. You know, right across the globe, young people, communities, activists, storytellers continue to show up in the face of adversity to hold the line, because 1.5 will be unreachable if we don't have radical, transformative pathways forward. For 28 years, we have come to these spaces, worked within these colonial structures, and agreed to disagree for progress. What will it take for power actually to see face and not race, to hear our voice really, so that our choice between life and death, you know, isn't that choice, because we are out of breath. And so, you know, as we look into this critical decade where science and research says that we need to drastically reduce emissions, we're in year 4 of it. You know, there are a few things coming up. There's like, next year will be 10 years since Paris Agreement. The year after that will be an Indigenous COP. And if we do win the bid, what does that relationship look like with Pacific? But what does those relationships about caring for country look like with First Nations people here in Australia? And so we need to continue to advocate, change systems, and work together in order for that collective change, because change is active, not passive. So thank you everyone for coming. Have a good night.
Thanks very much. And there we are. We gave ourselves an hour and a half, and we're right on the hour and a half. Sarah and Mamta, you have a minute each. Tell us what the next steps are. Sarah, maybe.
Hi. Yeah, that's a big thing to follow, I guess. Thanks, Tish, for your passion, and I think that's the reason that we all show up and we keep coming back to hear stories like that. yeah, I guess my final thought is I think, you know, COP will keep moving on. I think it evolves year on year, and it's up to us to make the changes. I think you see issues come out in the, you know, in the surrounding environment, and then they do make their way kind of into the formal part of COP. But I agree with Angelica as well that it's really slow. But we have to engage. We don't have another mechanism for doing the big global changes that are needed to be made. Yeah, just one other quick thought. I know I'm going into Mamta's time here. I think there's a really important point about collaboration that we need to think deeply about, and I think particularly as women and as feminist leaders, or as part of feminist leadership in the climate space. That example that Mamta gave before was incredibly powerful, and that was really an example that spoke of people working across silos and across different interest groups, really to do something that is pretty incredible. So I think, yeah, I think we have a contribution to make, and I think maybe a topic for another conversation another time. But yeah, I'd be interested in talking about that further.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And Mamta,
Very
CEO,
quickly,
the Executive Director of She Change Summit, what are you going to do this year?
yeah, so I just want to, for all the reasons that Tish mentioned, we will not back down. We will not slow the movement. We will keep the pressure going. The declaration of 12 members team was almost like a sign of how powerful collaboration is becoming, and they had to retract, and they had to now bring in 12 women members in. We cannot move back right now. This is a test, COP29, of our endurance, of our resilience, and we really, really need to just stay there, hold on, and grow stronger. And thank you so very much for this conversation. I loved it.
Thank you. And thank you very much to all of our guest conversationalists. It's been a marvelous conversation. And I just want to take us back to that notion of us being in circle with all of you wonderful participants who have been on this call. And I thank you for your engagement as well, and I hope you can take this circle into your circles and create new circles and circles within circles, and we can keep this movement growing. So thank you so much, and good night, everyone.